welcome to another episode of the Sfarim Chatter podcast and the second part of the Baal Shem Tov miniseries. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Zalmi Jacobs in memory of his grandfather, Rabbi Yaakov Katz, ben Shneir Zalman HaKoyen Zechanah Livracha, and Zalmi's mother, Chaya Golda Bas Yaakov HaKoyen and Liba Katz, all of whom were intrigued by and curious about the Baal Shem Tov and his progeny. To sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or check out the link and information in the show's notes. You can also find a link to subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new books, new Sfarim, and book deals, as well as the Sfarim Chatter status, where if you prefer to see it on WhatsApp that way, you can check it out that way. Also, if you can please subscribe to the podcast, rate and review wherever it is that you listen to podcasts, Apple, Spotify, 24/6, and so on. And finally, this mini-series is airing this week because the Baal Shem Tov's yahrzeit is on Shavuos. With that, enjoy this part 2 of the mini-series about the Baal Shem Tov. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode here about the Baal Shem Tov, history and legend. And once again, I'm joined by Professor Glenn Dynner. So the first episode, we discussed the Baal Shem Tov, historically, his biography, his context, where he lived, and so on. And now we're going to, again, a lot of this will overlap with the first one, but kind of as a follow-up, we'll discuss Hasidus before the Baal Shem Tov, so what led to the creation of Hasidus, and the Baal Shem Tov's role in that. And also we're going to discuss Shivchei Pesht more in depth. We referenced Shivchei Pesht throughout the first episode, but I think here we're going to explore a little bit more. So thank you, Professor Dynner, for joining me once again.
Okay, thanks for having me again.
So let's turn to what a reference there. What led to the rise or the creation of what we know as Hasidus today?
Well, I would say that it's really a transition from the old elitist ascetic form of Hasidism to a much more inclusive form of Hasidism. We could say mysticism generally. Inclusivity, though, that does not amount to egalitarianism. Right? The Besht essentially worked within the old institutionalized social hierarchy by cultivating young elites who would have been, the rabbis and the old-style mystics before he appeared. And he elevates them to positions of leadership, yet he still honors the piety of the poor, simple Jews in his teachings and in his approach. So if we're going to talk about upward mobility within the Hasidic leadership structure, we have to say it's relatively rare. It doesn't seem to happen any more often than it happened before. But we do have cases like the Maggid of Mezherich, the one who transformed Hasidism into a mass movement, seems to have derived from a humble background. There aren't really honorifics that you would expect from him, or honorifics about his father and about his teachers. But the best target group was the old-style ascetic Hasidim, who he was convincing to serve the public without relinquishing their elite status. And I think that's the key to understanding what this means socially or social historically. And if I could give an example from one teaching, the way that his teachings lent themselves to this new kind of social leadership, I should invoke a pretty famous teaching that Toldot Yaakov Yosef brings in the name of his teacher, the Besht, which is based on Brachot 17b in the Talmud. A heavenly voice declared, "All the world is sustained for the sake of Hanina, my son, and for the sake of is Bishvil, and Shvil can also be a channel, a conduit." So he explains, the Besht explains, the word Bishvil doesn't only mean for the sake of it, it implies that he made a channel to bring all the heavenly flow down into the material world. And then he elaborates, but it seems to me that not only did Hanina, who is this Talmudic sage, make a channel, but he himself became a channel through which the heavenly flow passes. So the tzaddik is really a righteous person traditionally and a mystic, but also a channel. And this works for those of you who are familiar with Kabbalah as well. This works in the heavenly structure. Now we have a human mystic who's also becoming this kind of a channel, more literally, And that channel allows the divine life force or bounty, the shefa, to flow down into the world and among the rest of the community. In another teaching, he says that tzaddik is the heart of the body, for he's the channel which draws the bounty of the life force from God to all the other limbs, which are the normal or ordinary people of his generation. And in turn, and this is crucial, many commandments are fulfilled through the people themselves. So the people themselves are honored, but in the end, they're known as people of matter, whereas the tzaddik, or the Hasidic leader, is known as a person of form, of like spirituality. And there's still this hierarchy that exists, but it's a hierarchy that's forgiven because of that kind of spiritual immediacy that's provided, the accessibility of this new Hasidic leader. And, that's very much appreciated. And in their teachings, they're honoring simple piety as well. So all of this eventually transforms Hasidism into a populist movement. It's not popular in the sense that anybody can be a leader, but it's populist, that people feel like they're heard and they're spoken to. And that seems to be the key of how Hasidism is eventually going to be created.
And so is this an outgrowth, essentially, of earlier, prior, Hasidic practices, essentially, not in the Hasidic sense, but like a Hasid, ascetic, mystical practices?
Well, absolutely, it's an outgrowth, but it kind of turns everything on its head through the anti-asceticism, the anti-isolationism, the anti-elitism. True, they remain an elite, but they're much more accessible elite who are meant to sort of channel the divine into the rest of the population. So it derives from the old style Hasidism, and there were definitely old style Hasidim who had achieved prominent positions, who are really the grounds on which the Besht and his colleagues and disciples are recruiting. But and those old style Hasidim, they find they're able to become more effective leaders because they were being rejected by communities for their extreme behaviors, their extreme fasting, their isolation. And this is very present throughout the book Toldot Yaakov Yosef, where he really seems wounded by the fact that he was ejected from his own post as a result of his old-style ascetic Hasidic practices. And now he's found a way. It's going to take a while, but he's found a way to become a leader, somebody who serves the people, again, without giving up his position as a mystic, as an elite. And so this is going to create a tension because the old-style Hasidim are still there. And so they're the ones who are going to become the first misnagdim, the first opponents of Hasidism. They believe that all of this dispensing of mystical wisdom, privileged wisdom to ordinary people is extremely vulgar, is extremely dangerous, and it looks to them a lot like Sabbatianism, the followers of the false messianic movement of Shabbatai Tzvi, and then more recently Jacob Frank. They really do see this as dangerous, and I think they also feel like they're losing power as these more populist Hasidim begin to gain ground. So yes, it's an outgrowth, but it also becomes a major, major foe of that old-style Hasidism. And, that popularization is going to be a real source of tension.
So that really gets to another question. Is that a kind of a famous trope or stereotype is that Hasidus was a social radicalism and pushback on the current social structures. Is that the case? Or is that not exactly accurate?
What do you mean by pushback?
Meaning, was Hasidus trying to be a populist/popular movement, trying to change the social norms of the time and try, that's like the general accepted feel. It was like this folksy for the people movement as opposed to the strict rabbinic elite structure of the time. Is that accurate or is that not exactly accurate?
So I think the trick is to not be seduced by this inclusivity that I've been talking about into making claims about egalitarianism or social revolution. The social structure really does remain virtually intact. Hasidism adopts a very folksy kind of image, and yet this is sort of like, I think we have this in a lot of movements, where a very folksy looking movement is still led by people, who were elites. I mean, the folk singer Pete Seeger went to Harvard, just as a random example. And, you can come up with many examples of this, but it doesn't matter to people because they feel like they're part of something now, that they're not sectioned off from these elites. And so, yeah, it's a kind of a conservative revolution, you could say, a spiritual revolution, but nothing like a social revolution. And as long as the Besht himself is seen cultivating the sons of elites, like Yaakov Yosef, like the Margolio brothers, who had great yichus, come from a line of many, a whole network of scholars who combined wealth and yichus. And, they're the ones who are going to be cultivated for leadership. And I actually did a study of this during my PhD for my dissertation, where I studied something like 50 early Hasidic leaders, tzaddikim. I found the majority really came from yichus, from distinguished lineage, and many were actually from a handful of the same families, the Shapiros, the Margolios, the Horowitzes, who had really, for centuries, kind of dominated rabbinical posts and been the wealthy merchants and been the elites of society. So it really doesn't change that much in terms of, I would say, the social hierarchy. What it does is it brings people together. It brings elites and common people together, and maybe gives common people the hope that by associating with one of these people of form, one of these tzaddikim, they too can learn how to transform the material world, into kind of holiness, even in their day-to-day lives. And they're allowed to really think this as long as they're under the auspices, under the leadership and guidance of a tzaddik, who really did usually derive from the elite. That's not to say there wasn't a lot of social criticism in Hasidic literature. The early Hasidic teachings really do condemn prideful, inaccessible behavior among rabbis. Yaakov Yosef even refers to them as demons. And tzaddikim were encouraged to descend and mix with the common Jews. And common parable that the Besht would offer is the parable of the nobleman who is trying to bring the prince, the wayward prince, back to the king. And several noblemen actually try this, and the prince, rejects them and pushes them away. But this one nobleman, really, he dresses like a common person, and he hangs out with the prince, and he drinks with him, and he tells stories with him, and he gradually is able to bring the prince back to the king in this manner. That's the way you're supposed to do it. You have to go down and get your hands dirty and associate with people of lowly deeds, as they're called in the parable, to speak to their hearts, to stir them into the realization that they're far from the King of Kings and they should return to him. That's the idea, that you really have to get over yourself, get over your elitism, and go and mix with everybody. And that includes women. Many, possibly most of the early followers of these new style Hasidim, these tzaddikim, were actually women. This is a very common complaint in Misnagdic literature, that they're taking advantage of the naivete of women, supposedly, and they're attracting all these women. Wives are secretly going to visit these tzaddikim against the wishes or knowledge of their husbands. And what's interesting about the position of women, too, is, yes, this is a very patriarchal and androcentric movement, in public. In public, the public spiritual roles are almost always men. But even early on, even in Shivchei Abesht, you have figures like Rivla the pious and the wife of Abraham Hamalach, who's the son of the Maggid of Mezrich, and Adel, who's the daughter of the Besht, as having real spiritual power. And I think it's also easy to fall into the trap of believing that women were excluded from this group, that they couldn't be Hasidic or Hasidot, right? And it turns out there was a role for them. It's just not very public. They would create their own embedded networks kind of behind the scenes and really cultivate crucial aspects of Hasidism, from foodways to crafts to oral traditions, often which feature holy women in them. So I'm not talking about egalitarianism again, but it is a kind of an inclusivity. And we get a glimpse of a vital, rich, behind-the-scenes female Hasidic world as well, if we really look closely.
Yeah, it's almost interesting or ironic to point out today's Hasidus and Rebbe's in thinking of the original Hasidus, but that's a conversation for a different time. This is just about really the Baal Shem Tov and the origins of Hasidus. And so what's the Baal Shem Tov's role? Now, going back to the Baal Shem Tov, what's his role in all of what you just spoke about? Do we know what his role he plays?
What role does he play in terms of popularization, are you asking?
Popularization, yeah, like you were saying, really,
right.
Mingling with the general public, changing, again, not radically changing the social structure, but kind of tweaking it or the changes that happens.
So most scholars believe that he really is interested in elites, and even the stories of Shivchei Abesht have him trying to win over the members of the Brody Cloys. If you recall, we talked about this group that was really the most famous and elitist old-style Hasidim, old-style mystics. And he's trying to break into this group, and Rabbi Gershon, his brother-in-law, is a member of that Brody Cloys. That seems to be the aspiration. But we find in Shivchei Abesht, she's also being portrayed as somebody who's willing to champion the vulnerable. If, for example, a widow is being pushed out or outcompeted from her arenda, from her lease, the Besht will intervene on her behalf and see to it that either the usurper is punished or is convinced, dissuaded from doing this. So he does seem to have this image of protecting the vulnerable. Rossman rejects that image as a later kind of anachronism that was meant to portray him as a social revolutionary. We don't know, though. We just don't know. We have to wonder why such stories would simply be fabricated. It does seem that the Besht has a sensitivity, but his primary goal throughout most of his career does seem to be to win over elites, especially the young elites, to his style of non-ascetic Hasidism that is really going to, I would say, transform the spiritual leadership of East European Jewry. That does seem to be his main project. He wants to spread his teachings because he believes that this is good for society. And as I mentioned in our last session, these young mystics really were hurting themselves and sometimes even dying as a result of their asceticism. So, yes, we have indications of a sensitivity, but if you recall, Rossman did find that the Besht was not intervening in any of the local conflicts, the social conflicts that were happening. So it's really hard to portray him as anything more than somebody who had those kinds of sensitivities.
So it's not as black and white as maybe the general public or people think when they think about the rise of Hasidus from the Baal Shem Tov on. There's a lot more gray in there, essentially.
Right. And if somebody's not setting out to create a socio-political movement, they're simply out to teach this radically new approach to mysticism, one which they believe strongly in, that will benefit everybody, then We don't need a social revolution. That's not the primary concern. The primary concern is transforming Judaism itself. But the result of that transformation, because it lends itself to accessibility, it really does, I would say give an opening to a much more popular or populist approach.
Yeah, and Rossman shows this, talking about the Baal Shem Tov's relationship with the rabbinate and with, particularly when it came to Shkita and Sheikhtim, how he wasn't necessarily always against the established rabbinic leadership. That's not always what was going on, despite that it's portrayed that way. So what do we see in the Baal Shem Tov, in his theology, his world outlook, his thought, his Torah, if we have any written Torah? Where do we see this coming through with him?
What's the this?
Again, this is, again, using a general term, but everything that we've been referring to here over the past few minutes.
Well, if I could address one aspect, which I think is the most important, is the anti-asceticism. That is something that we really do have good evidence of. So we can find this as original Baal Shem Tov teachings, that we find it in one letter that was printed in Shivchei Abesht that he wrote to his disciple, Yaakov Yosef, which I'd actually like to read if that's okay. I think it's just so important and really probably a very authentic, teaching. The letter goes like this. I received your letter at the conclusion of the Sabbath, and I saw that in the first 2 lines you, sir, said that you must fast. I'm deeply upset at your words, and let me add that by the decree of the watchers and God and his Shekinah, the divine presence, you should not place yourself in this danger. This is the way of melancholy and sadness, and the Shekinah does not dwell within sadness, but only through the joy of doing mitzvot. Okay, and this is actually a direct quotation from the Talmud, from Shabbat 30b, which for some reason scholars have missed this in the past, but it's an important, I'll return to that in a second. In any case, the letter continues, as is known to you, sir, these are things I've taught repeatedly, and they should be close to your heart in the thoughts that bring you to this melancholy. And then the Besh concludes with advice to contemplate the letters with utmost devotion every morning while you are studying. That's a much more effective method. But if we return to the Talmudic quotation, it really is important that he's simply quoting something that already existed in Jewish traditional literature, in Shabbat 30b, right? She'ein Shekhinah shora lo mitoch atzvut, that the Shekhinah does not dwell within sadness. That's what he picks out. But the actual original Talmudic teaching is, and also the Shekhinah does not dwell within laziness and sort of light-mindedness and joking and frivolity, and that he doesn't include, right? Ella mitoch devar simcha shel mitzvah, right? That it only resides or dwells within the joy of doing a commandment or a mitzvah, right? And that's part of the original. But it's fascinating because the Besht is doing what Elliot Wilson described as the traditionalist approach. You retrieve an abandoned part of the tradition and you kind of repurpose it, right? So he's going to make this front and center, that the joy of doing mitzvot should be everything. And you should not be fasting because that repels the Shekhinah, as we even have alluded to in part of that Talmudic phrase. So this is kind of what the Besht is doing, and I think it's his main project, is to teach these elites to stop fasting unnecessarily, excessively, we can say, and to start focusing on joy, on a positive approach to the mitzvot. And that's going to be his main emphasis. Does that lend itself to a more popular movement? Absolutely. Because everybody is attracted to this idea that, wait a minute, I don't need to fast. I don't need to deny myself. I can actually do the mitzvot, perform the mitzvot in a state of joyousness. And of course, that can translate into singing and drinking and storytelling and dancing, all these things that we know about Hasidism that are definitely part of this early movement as well. At least we think they are based on Shevchei Besht. But I would say that it's targeted at the young elites in this very early stage.
Because as we've discussed and as we've mentioned, the ascetic practices, mystical practices, this really was going on before. This was a common occurrence, but as you're saying, he was kind of the Baal Shem Tov, and then Hasidus was anti-ascetic practices, so incorporating mysticism without the asceticism kind of thing is essentially what happened.
Yes. And, there have been new studies that have really looked at his teachings closely. They're not quite as joyous as they're usually made out to be. It's interesting, I should mention Liora Sachs-Shmueli's study. She used digital humanities analysis to look at original Besht teachings, and she found that they're not actually usually talking about joy. They're much more talking about fear and regret and regret over sinning. And that actually happens to be his emphasis at the time. So in other words, you don't go directly to joy. You have to work through your repentance, your tshuva, and then you reach a state of joy, which is interesting because the image of the Baal Shem Tov, certainly one promoted by later writers, is just complete joy and you could say leniency. And that was not the case. So we can't go too far with this. The point is that the new style Hasidism does take a lot of work. According to the Besht, you have to work through your own shortcomings and your sins, but your ultimate goal is to reach that state of joyful performance of mitzvot. And by doing so, you're bringing everybody else up with you. So you kind of go down to this state of, this state of lowliness, and you pull everybody up. And that's a very appealing kind of a teaching that, again, lends itself to a much more popular movement.
Do we know where that popular view of him and his thought comes from?
It's really hard to say. It developed in the oral tradition. It's interesting that Abraham Joshua Heschel really does, in a book that appeared in English called A Passion for Truth. It's actually originally in Yiddish. This really provides a contrast between the Besht and the Kotzker Rebbe. And it is based on all kinds of oral traditions that Heschel heard growing up in his Hasidic household. And yet, if we look back at the original Besht, he really does look a lot more like the Kotzker Rebbe, who's this more angry, severe kind of figure, who's always urging people to do better and to repent. And actually, the Besht, if you read Shevchei Besht cover to cover, as I did before this program, you'll see he's a little bit short-tempered. He's yelling at doctors. He's yelling at demons, of course. And he isn't the cheerful kind of Besht that we find in later Hasidic tales. I think it's important to consider the context. There are very different contexts. The Besht was working within a context of excessive, life-endangering asceticism. And so, he's not going all the way to joy. He's gradually teaching these new techniques for, engaging materiality and transforming materiality very, very cautiously. The Kotzker is in the mid-19th century, when the Hasidic world has become kind of excessive in its joy and celebrations and opulence. There you have these Hasidic courts that have arisen. And so the Kotzker is much more of a reformer. He wants to get back to a more austere form of piety that the Besht in his own day was trying to soften. So they are two very different figures, but they both actually come across as somewhat similar in their temperament. It's just, I guess you could say, that the Besht does come across as a little bit more concerned with the vulnerable, with going out into the world. And the Kotzker becomes very secluded, especially towards the end of his life. So there is that contrast that is accurate. But just if we're only going to focus on the Besh, I think we have a much more complex figure than that later image of joyful simplicity. And this was not a simple, joyous individual. He worked very, very hard to try to kind of develop this new form of Hasidism.
So you mentioned the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov, and you said original. You mentioned this before. What original Torah of the Baal Shem Tov do we have?
Right. So there are going to be original teachings in several works, Toldo Yaakov Yosef, Degel Machne Ephraim, and Keter Shem Tov. It's hard to be sure you're actually reading an original Besht teaching, but it does say in the name of my teacher, the Besht, in many cases. So, scholars look at those and take those, introductions very seriously. And that's how Leora Sachs-Shmueli was able to do her study, is every time it mentions in the name of my teacher. Okay. There are scholars, though, who are very skeptical about this and feel that, even if it was an original Besht teaching, it was filtered through another teacher, whoever it might be, Yaakov Yosef. And therefore, anytime you repeat a teaching, you are potentially changing it in one way or another. You're bending it to your own worldview. You're reacting to the urgencies of your current moments of, contemporary concerns. So there is that problem as well. If we're going to be extremely machmir, or strict about this, we have to say we have the Holy Epistle in its various versions. We have that letter I just read in Shefei HaBesht, and we have another letter or two that we've been able to authenticate more or less, and that's it. That's really it.
So what do we do with Toldos Yaakov Yosef? And he really quotes him a lot.
I think we read it with caution, I guess a grain of salt. But I would say, I would tend to, maybe this is my own disposition, I would tend to say, don't be so strict about everything. This is the best thing we have. And the worst thing you can do is to tell people it's unreliable, it's untrustworthy. No, I'm sure a lot of it really is reliable and trustworthy, even if it might potentially be skewed by the secondhand transmission. I think we have to study and read this because we do get a relatively consistent picture of somebody who loved to speak in parables, of somebody who gave very simple and direct teachings, somebody who was very concerned to overcome the reigning extreme asceticism. I mean, there are consistencies there. And you don't want to give people an excuse to neglect these kinds of teachings. I mean, I think these are gems, and we need to maybe treat them a little bit cautiously. But overall, we have to think about the picture that it forms. And that's true, by the way, of Shefei HaBesht, which is, we've referred to many times, which is the earliest collection of testimonies, oral traditions about the Besht.
I will just mention one more thing with Toldos Yaakov Yosef is that it was printed, it wasn't, and this has been explored by Rossman and the Atticus, perhaps also, if I remember correctly, that it was published, but not exactly by him. So they took different things, they put it together, and so sometimes that might also be another issue with it at times, right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, and okay, so that could be accurate. But at the same time, it's the best thing we have. These are very serious people. And, I think historians often forget that when you're relaying a teaching by a revered teacher in this kind of society, you're being very careful with it. You're trying to retain its original power, and you want to honor your teacher and your teacher's wisdom. And so I think these are relatively reliable transmitters of teachings that we shouldn't simply treat like anybody, and that point often gets lost. Yaakov Yosef was an extremely serious individual, maybe to a fault. So it's hard to imagine him just being careless with the best teachings. I'm talking more about unconscious kinds of transformations of teachings that he might not have been aware of. He might emphasize one thing or another. But by and large, I think it is very trustworthy, as long as we bear in mind that the Besht, unlike some of his disciples, was not a creator of a movement consciously, and they were. So that might be one thing to bear in mind as we read.
Okay, so let's talk about Shivchei Besht a little bit. This is something that we've referenced a number of times. And so let's talk about Shivchei Besht in the sense of the book itself, where the book came from, when it was printed, I think 1814. This is a little bit after the Baal Shem Tov dies in 1760. So how did this book come to be? There's the manuscripts. We've already referenced the different manuscripts of the book. Let's start there.
Okay, well, the story seems to be that Rabbi Dovber of Linitz, who's the son-in-law of the Besht's scribe, Alexander Shochet, actually is working from several manuscripts, he says. He probably heard a lot of traditions as well. And he brings them to this printer, and he's actually a Lubavitcher printer named Yisrael Yaffa, who's also a disciple of the Alter Rebbe of Chabad, near Zalman of Liadi. And the printer can't resist adding another bunch of tales to these manuscripts that he receives. So he he adds tales 1 through 16 that he heard from the Alter Rebbe of Lubavitch. They're very interesting tales as well, but some of them are much more legendary. Ironically, I would say it's a combination of very legendary and very historical tales, those 1 through 16. And then it begins with Dovber of Linitz's tales, which are tale 17 to the very end. And these accounts give a very different picture of the Besht. He's much more portrayed, I would say, as a Baal Shem, as performing exorcisms and healing and other magical activities. He's also portrayed several times as a tavern keeper. That's something that the Alter Rebbe does not include, and as one of his occupations. Both of them agree that he was a Malamed, he was a school teacher, but this is an added thing that maybe the Alter Rebbe didn't think was very dignified, that the Besht was a tavern keeper. Maybe he felt it was maybe better not to mention that. In any case, we do have the very first printing happening in Kopis in 1814, but immediately it's reprinted. It appears 3 times in Hebrew and 3 times in Yiddish over the next 3 years. So between 1814 and 1817, one edition from Ostrug, which was thought to be lost from 1815, was just discovered by Yonatan Meir, an Israeli scholar. And, what do we do with all this? Moshe Rossman, the Machmir, argues that it is hagiography, meaning it's legendary, it's meant to inspire, and in truth, it's actually, the introduction does say that my point is not to write a history, my point is to inspire this generation which has fallen so low and been tempted by Shabbatai Tzvi and so on and so forth. So not even pretending to be strict history, it's much more meant to inspire piety. Rossman says that it can only really hint that an event actually happened. And this upset a lot of other scholars of Hasidism who felt that was way too strict a measure. It was way too positivist. They accused him of being kind of a naive positivist, where he's so strict in his standards, what can be a reliable source, that he throws out almost everything. These are very rich, evocative, stories that some of which really do seem to contain a lot of historical material. It's just a very difficult thing to figure out how to read that in a way that you sort of sift out the more historical elements. In an article I wrote, I adopted something called a criterion of embarrassment, which scholars of other religious traditions and charismatic figures have used to basically say that if we all agree that something is written by the disciples or the admirers of a religious figure, that's actually an advantage because it allows us to treat the more negative admissions, and you could argue for neutral elements as well, more seriously. In other words, there are lots of things that don't help that goal of inspiring somebody. Let's think about the Besht's various occupations. He's a Melamed, which was rather low status in that society. And a tavern keeper, even lower status probably, especially for a spiritual leader. And, he's digging clay, according to one of the accounts in the earlier tales. So these are things that we have to take more seriously because they don't actually inspire, they actually embarrass. And they are potentially true. Nobody would make these things up. I mean, they would be excoriated for it by the followers. They'd be condemned for it. If they did, it's more likely something that was widely known about the spiritual leader that they kind of had to include, or they included inadvertently, that, everybody knows that he was a tavern keeper or whatever. And we move on from there. But the main thing is, that we have a kind of massive corpus of material, and it can't all be fiction and legend. It does a disservice, again, what I said about the seriousness. It does a disservice to the very serious people who would transmit these accounts, sometimes giving exact names. I heard it from Alexander Shochet, for example, and that's a form of footnoting that any scholar would actually recognize. So I think that, this is a complex body of material. 50 years after the death of the figure is not so long. If you think about it, it's a generation later. There are people still alive, possibly, who knew him, at least as children. And, this is probably something that we can use as historians, and even better if we can corroborate it with external evidence, which does happen sometimes.
Yeah, Rossman's approach is somewhat like throw the baby out with the bathwater type of thing. It's just like everything is gone. And so, but on the flip side, one more thing worth mentioning is that you do see when you read Shif Chabesh, anyone who reads it. So, by the way, there's a lot of editions, and we'll get to that, I guess, when we get to the suggested reading at the end. I'll leave that for a little bit. But there are a lot of folk tale motifs you see when he goes like underground. He tries to travel to the land of Israel, and he meets this like frog that's reincarnated, and a lot of these other type of folk tale motifs throughout that are just like, popular type of things. But there's a lot of history. There's a lot of Torah, there's other things in there as well. And the flip side is Edkis, right? I think Emmanuel Edkis in his book, which is kind of taking the position that I don't think he takes the position of like it's all true, but somewhat takes not exactly that, but he's almost like the flip of what Rossman does.
Yeah, I wouldn't go so far either. I would say that Edkis almost punts on this. If our listeners understand American football, everybody, but he sort of like dodges the issue because he says, I am concerned in this book about the image of the Besht. And Shivka Besht is an accurate reflection of how the Besht was perceived by his contemporaries. Okay. But does that really help the social historian? I'm not so sure. I mean, yeah, okay, it's interesting that we have this image, but some of us would really like to figure out what actually happened to the best of our abilities, what life was like, what was the impact of the Besht, what were patterns that emerged, and I like to read Shivcha Besht for patterns. And I can list a couple that are repeated again and again and again, which to my mind enhances their reliability. Number one, the anti-asceticism. the star disciples come to him having already, hurt themselves, maimed themselves, or been ejected from their positions and communities because of their excessive old-style Hasidic practice. Okay, and so he's going to provide them with a better way, of still being Hasidic and still being a mystic without all these. That's a pattern that I think has to be accurate and matches up with some of the more authenticated, letters and testimonies we have. Another theme is his approach to anti-Jewish violence. There are occurrences of anti-Jewish violence. He actually fails to prevent blood libels, which is interesting as an admission. He explains them. He tries to prevent them. And, at the same time, it doesn't sound like a very miraculous kind of occurrence if it doesn't succeed, so he's not flying through the air in a lot of these tales. He's really, his miracles are mundane. Sometimes they fail. There are other themes as well that are interesting, but those are a few that I really picked out, in addition to his own kind of humility, which the tales, the stories in Shifrei HaBesht will explain as his incognito phase. He disguised himself as a common person. Okay. Or we could be more real about this and say maybe he really was from a humble background and he arose to this incredible position of influence. I don't see why that's so insulting to his legacy. In fact, everybody loves that story of upward mobility in, American culture. That's what we actually prize, that sort of coming from nothing type motif. I think it was more embarrassing for this society. In any case, I just want to point out that if you have these patterns that are recurring, they do gesture towards a certain kind of historical reliability.
So let's talk a little bit about Shifrei HaBesht itself. And we've referenced it multiple times throughout, but what are some themes that we see running throughout Shifrei HaBesht? I know earlier I mentioned Rav Gershon Kitover, and the Baal Shem Tov's brother-in-law, and there's kind of this, it portrays Rav Gershon as having a negative attitude towards the Baal Shem Tov multiple times, and he's proven wrong every time. There's one story with the mezuzah, the Baal Shem Tov doesn't kiss it, and he's like, what's going on? And then he walks out, and then the Rav they've been visiting, he's like, well, he did it. He's like, oh, we'll check it. It's puzzle. And he's like, oh, indeed it is. They pull it out, something like that. That's the one I remember. But it's countless stories with him portraying him. He's always getting angry at the Baal Shem Tov, and that's one theme running throughout. It's not a theme almost. I guess that's it's in countless stories there. But what are some of the themes of Shifrei HaBesht?
So they're the ones I just mentioned, right? Which are sort of the incognito besht of appearing to be from humble backgrounds, the anti-asceticism. There's anti-Sabbatian moments in there too, but they're not extreme anti-Sabbatianism. It seems like some of the early followers even might have been one-time Sabbatians, so that's kind of interesting. But by and large, there's a very sort of firm rejection of Sabbatianism itself without rejecting Sabbatians. They can actually become part of this movement. Their themes, they're kind of interesting from the perspective of gender. Women are definitely supporting their mystical, scholarly husbands, and the Besht's own wife seems to be doing this, whether she's running a tavern or working, in the marketplace. That was an interesting feature of East European Jewish society, that women actually worked, and in some cases, they even were the sole breadwinners, and this seems to be the case here. And yet you also have women in I guess, more spiritual roles that I alluded to before. Adele especially is one of them. You have, I would say when we get back to Rabbi Gershon, you're right. You do have this tense relationship, which is ironic because in the Holy Epistle, there's nothing but love between them. So it seems like the Besht really did have to win over his brother-in-law. And one story in Shifrei HaBesht, there are many, but one that really struck me was this incident, it's the 15th tale, where the Besht has a guest who's a disciple of Rabbi Gershon, and the guest is forced to stay there for Shabbat, and the Besht pretends to be his common self. But then, actually, in the middle of the night, the guest wakes up and he sees a large fire burning on the oven. And I'll just read from it. He ran to the oven because he thought that the wood on the oven was burning. He saw that it was a great light. Then he was hurled backwards and fainted. They revived him. The Besht said to him, "You should not have looked at what is not permitted to you." The guest marveled at what had happened. And what was happening was the Besht was actually praying and created this, incredible light. And so he sort of revealed himself. And then in the morning, the Besht goes back to pray in his house of seclusion. And then he comes in and he asks, at the Sabbath table, he asks during the course of the meal for his guest to say some Torah. And he cites a phrase and interprets it. And then the Besht responds to him, "I heard another interpretation of this phrase." And after the meal, he went to his house of seclusion. And after Mincha, he returned and revealed himself. He said Torah and revealed such secrets of the Torah that no one had ever heard before. They prayed Mariv, evening service. He made Havdalah, which closes out the Sabbath, in the usual fashion. Afterwards, he commanded his guest to go to our master and Rabbi Gershon, but he was not to reveal anything. He was instead to go to the sect of the great Hasidim in town, in Brody, and also to the rabbi of the community and say, "There is a great light living near your community, and it will be worthwhile for you to seek him out and bring him to town." When all the Hasidim and the rabbi heard these things, they decided it must refer to the Besht. They recalled their questions about him, which now seemed clear. All of them went to his village to invite him to come to town. The Besht had foreseen what would happen, and he went towards the town as they were going out to see him. And when they encountered each other, they all went to a place in the forest where they made a chair out of branches of trees, and they placed him on the chair and accepted him as their rabbi, and the Besht said Torah to them. Okay, so that's an interesting, complex kind of combination of fact and fiction. We doubt very much that they make a throne for the Besht. They all accept him right away based on this one revelation or appearance. However, we do know that in the Brody Cloys, gradually, there are going to be members who are attracted to the Besht, and eventually Rabbi Gershon himself. So this is a reflection of that. He does win over some of them. Others, however, he doesn't win over. It's interesting that Rabbi Gershon eventually leaves Brody and moves to Medjugorje, and then, makes Aliyah, goes to the land of Israel. That's all interesting. It suggests, actually, that the Besht failed to win over the entire Brody Cloys or the entire Brody community, even if he won over some of them. And just to put a point on it, one of the first bans of excommunication, first bans against Hasidism, came from Brody in 1772. So it does seem like Brody really, really is a place of a center of the old-style Hasidim still who become misnagdim, or opponents of Hasidism. And they do so because they're extremely sensitive to Sabbatianism. They're the ones who battled Yonatan Eibeshitz, who was found to have some Sabbatian leanings and amulets. They're the ones who led the charge against Jacob Frank and Frankism. So they're extremely sensitive to anything that seems like it might be Sabbatian. And we do see certain teachings that lend themselves to that suspicion. The idea of the tzaddik who must descend into the common people. That sounds a lot like the descent of Sabbatians that appears in there. But what they're doing really is they're remaining very much within the bounds of halakha, Jewish law, and yet they're borrowing or appropriating some of these concepts that you really do need to descend. You can't always be in a lofty state of mystical inspiration, a devikut, right? So this looks to some people like it might be Sabbatianism. And so, what we have here is a reflection of that tension, which I think is actually pretty valuable because, wouldn't it be great if the Besh just appeared to Rabbi Gershon's disciple and won over the Brody Cloys right away? Wouldn't that be great? It didn't exactly happen that way, but it's not a false story. He really does win over some of them, and eventually he wins over Rabbi Gershon himself.
So really, in conclusion, to look at Shivchei Besh, and there's countless stories that we can sit and say and read the tales. I mean, that's really where you get a lot of the tales of the Baal Shem Tov come from Shivchei Besh. What can, in conclusion, so do we look at it as a historical document? Is it a collection of legends? Is it somewhere in the middle? Where do you come down on that?
Well, I think it's definitely a collection of oral traditions. There's been a move among historians to take oral traditions more seriously, to not simply say that you have to disqualify them because they may contain exaggerations or inaccuracies. In actual fact, it's possible to read oral traditions that are eventually, published in the case of Shivchei Besh in a sensitive way, where you look for those things that seem more likely and less likely. I think also a lot of the reflections of the Besh as, coming from this humble background, I believe nobody was making this up. And we do get a very rich kind of picture of this Baal Shem, who was actually, in my opinion, more interesting because he didn't have the advantages of an elite background and an elite education on the level of some of his disciples, and yet he manages to win them over to this new way of looking at the universe. And that's, I think, nothing that diminishes, but only enhances the greatness of the Baal Shem Tov. And I think that whatever explanation that Shivchei Besh supplies for those humble beginnings, they call it an incognito phase. Okay, fine. But they are reflecting an aspect of his biography, which is very valuable to us. And it does seem like nobody's going to make up, their leader coming from humble backgrounds. I suppose there's some attraction to a Cinderella story, but it just seems to happen too much throughout in a consistent way to just dismiss it. And I think that, we can read these tales as reflecting, aspects of the Besh's biography that, of course, we read them very carefully and we look for corroboration whenever we can, but we absolutely don't dismiss this extremely rich body of material.
Yeah. And so I think now I'll mention, before we close with some final comments, the suggested reading material. As I mentioned, we've mentioned this before, Moshe Rossman's book, Founder of Hasidism, A Quest for the Historical Baal Shem Tov, with a new introduction where he refutes, pushes back on Edkis. So that's published by Littman, and I'll put a link to that in the show's notes. And then there's, on the other hand, there's Edkis, which is the Besh, magician, mystic, and leader, published by Brandeis. And it's really good to read them in tandem, one and the other. You kind of see some of the stuff is overlaps, and then you see how they play off each other. So that's that. There's also, I mentioned Shivchei Besh, so there is an English edition. It's out of print, but it's called In Praise of the Baal Shem Tov, Shivchei Besh, translated and edited by Dan Ben Amos and Jerome Mintz. This was published by Indiana University Press. If I find the link, it's used, I can put it up. There is a very nice critical edition by Avram Rubinstein, Shivchei Besh, and the original Hebrew by Reuben Mass. There's also, if you go to regular Sfarim Store, you can find a whole bunch of Shivchei Besh. They're different. There's a bunch of different ones. They have tweaks. This one has this kind of added materials and that kind of added material. They're all like a little different, adding different comments and quotes and things like that. Those are kind of the, I guess, main books on Baal Shem Tov. Anything else that you want to add, books or articles wise, to specifically, again, not only all Hasidus, but to Baal Shem Tov wise for suggested reading to listeners?
So if we're talking about just the Besh, I'd say there are interesting articles that I've mentioned throughout. by Eli Moseson and by Moshe Idel. And, these, perhaps we can provide the exact information for those. These are scholars doing really interesting work on the Besht. And, I think we also should probably think a lot about the way that the Besht's teachings do emerge into a mass movement. And for that, Ada Rappaport Albert has done really important work on the next generation, of Hasidic leaders. And, there's early Hasidism is a fascinating phenomenon because it does actually seem like this transition is made where we go from these teachings where they're really aimed at a small circle of mystics, trying to get them to be less ascetic and transform their way they look at the world. And this becomes something that can be applied to the masses, even those who are not learned. So that to me is really fascinating in and of itself. To be able to teach a merchant that what he's doing in his daily life, trying to make a living, is not sinful. It's not even mundane. It's possible to be holy within that activity if he focuses on the fact that he's trying to earn a living to pay for his son's yeshiva tuition or his daughter's, matches. And he's taken this mundane act and he's elevated it to something holy. That's something that the Besht innovated, where he will interpret, certain mundane, even sinful thoughts that we have as all being candidates for transformation. He gives this technique to his students, his disciples, that you just need to focus on the source of the pride that you're feeling, which is Tiferet in the spherotic structure, or whatever lust you're feeling, and you elevate it to its source. That becomes then translated into workaday Jewish lives in a way that they too can become holy through their ordinary pursuits. And that whole process is fascinating. Seth Brody has written a really important and interesting article about this process that I would like to emphasize, especially. And there are others as well, doing this work on early Hasidism.
Yeah, and that's really for a future episode, series, mini-series that'll have to be left for. But really, I think to finish off is that how do Baal Shem Tov's teachings evolve into what we know as Hasidus? And it's not only his teachings, it's also just the Baal Shem Tov. We're starting this series. I started off, the first thing we spoke about was, why are we starting a discussion on Hasidus with the Baal Shem Tov? Well, how does the Baal Shem Tov now segue into early Hasidus, which you were just mentioning?
Right, exactly. And I think the way it's done is there are actually several approaches. It's almost like a template, where Nachman of Bratslav, who's a direct descendant of the Besht, has one approach, and Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich, has a very different approach. And so you have these different schools and then eventually dynasties that emerge. But it's fascinating to see the way which each one of them, if they're interested in creating a court and a dynasty and a school of Hasidism, how they take these very basic teachings of one's ability to transform the material world and spiritualize the material world, and they really do teach that approach in their own way, and it can be quite beautiful. It can really be quite beautiful. Where to take the Maggid of Mezrich as an example, you think that you see this ugly material world, but if you actually ponder that the whole earth is filled with God's glory, which is the phrase from Isaiah, and there's no place free of him, all these things we quoted in the very beginning, and that everything's filled with the vital energy of the Creator, then it follows that everything you see is going to be that vital energy of the Creator, right? A vital energy of the divine. And that's all you see. And imagine this new way of seeing the world, where everything has a holy spark. So, it comes to be something that people really attempted and sometimes achieved, and it becomes a whole disposition on the world. Like this very, I would say, optimistic, right? The ugliness that you see in life in Eastern Europe towards the end of the 19th century is going to become increasingly violent, and into the 20th century, and dangerous. And there's much more poverty, economic despair. This idea, though, that you can actually learn to see the world as permeated with divinity must have given people a lot of hope and a lot of motivation to carry on, a lot of inspiration, all the way down to the Holocaust and really beyond into new centers in America and Israel. So, I think if we take that from the best, realize like that was really his major innovation, is a disposition of optimism about the ability to find the divine in everything.
Okay, so hopefully this miniseries or 2 episodes, however you want, 2-part episode, however you want to put it, hopefully this was informative and interesting for the listener. Just a little bit about the Baal Shem Tov. Of course, we can go on and on. There's a lot more to say, what we know, what we don't know. And so thank you, Professor Dynner, for joining me to talk about the Baal Shem Tov.
Okay, thanks for having me.
In the back of the wagon of the Baal Shem Tov, in the back of the wagon of the Besh. With who? In the back of the wagon of the Baal Shem Tov.